Okay, so this is the rest of chapter 5. All right, so we left off with talking about how children develop language. And so we left off with talking about some of the errors that they make in using language. Now we're going to move into how they start to actually put words together. So one of the things that you will see with infants in particular and with young children is that they will use what are called hollow phrases. So a hollow phrase is using one word to communicate an entire thought. So just one word essentially stands for an entire complete thought. So you might have a child who says up. So one word, up, and up typically means, right, pick me up, or I want you to pick me up, or something like that. Or they might say, you know, bottle, to tell you, I would like my bottle, please. Okay, so they're using just one word to communicate an entire thought, and then they progressively become more sophisticated in their use of language, and so they start to use this telegraphic speech. And so this telegraphic speech, think of it as the way that you speak when you text someone. So you don't use complete sentences. You don't worry about things being grammatically correct. You are only using the most high impact, essential words that you need to be able to get your point across. So toddlers will start to use this telegraphic speech, stringing together 2 to 3 word utterances to try to get their point across. So for example, they might say, "Mommy, go," right, to mean like mommy is going to work or something like that. Okay, so they'll just put together those 2 to 3 words, stringing them together. So they're getting there, right? They're getting there in terms of their language sophistication, but they're not quite there yet. So if you're interested in what a typical conversation looks like with a toddler, definitely check out this video. All right, so let's talk about some of the theories of language development. So there are 2 theories that are out there right now in the literature. So one is a behavioral theory of language development. So according to the behavioral theory, guess what we're looking at? Yes, consequences. So consequences, so reinforcement of using particular words, that is how children learn language, and also imitation. So listening to other people's speech, and that is how children learn language. So that's part of it, right? But we also know that children put together words in orders that we have never seen before. So grammar, we also know that children are not necessarily getting reinforced every single time that they say a word. So it doesn't necessarily help to explain that particular aspect of language development. The other theory of language development that's out there is by linguist Noam Chomsky. So Noam Chomsky hypothesized that within the brain, there is what he calls a language acquisition device. So to be clear, this is not like a specific part of the brain, but this is like a theoretical concept that essentially states that the brain is hardwired. It is expecting to be exposed to language, and it responds directly to that expected kind of experience here. So the brain is hardwired to acquire language, and if you think back to the parts of the brain that you hopefully remember from intro psychology, you might remember Broca's area and Wernicke's area. So Broca's area is involved in speech production, so the ability to actually talk, so to move your mouth, to move your tongue, vocal cords to be able to actually talk. And then Wernicke's area is involved in speech comprehension, which is the ability to actually understand what you're hearing. So both of those particular areas, very, very, very active. And so from Chomsky's perspective, that is some evidence that the brain is hardwired for this particular type of experience. So typically, when we're trying to understand how do children learn language, we're going to combine these perspectives together, okay? So there is likely some degree of reinforcement and imitation that explains how children learn language, but there also, of course, is understanding of the brain is involved here also, okay? So looking at Chomsky's perspective plus a behavioral perspective for language. All right, so we've got several areas of the brain that are, directly involved in learning language. So of course, the auditory cortex being able to hear, the visual cortex being able to see, right? So see exactly what you're reading, for example. Fusiform face area, so being able to kind of use that particular face information to be able to produce language. Your amygdala, your hippocampus is in here as well, and the superior temporal sulcus. So all of these involved in the emotion that's involved in language, and also the memory that is required for language, the perception, so being able to kind of take disparate pieces and put it together to produce language. And then here in the frontal lobes, so we've got the medial region, the orbital frontal cortex, and prefrontal cortex. So all of these areas working together to typically kind of help us with that working memory. So to be able to think about, you know, what do I want to say, and then be able to actually string it together in a way that makes sense. So tons of areas in the brain that are involved in language development. All right, we've also got, and we've talked about Jeannie a little bit before, but remember that Jeannie is an example of someone who was extremely deprived in terms of her exposure to that sensitive and responsive caregiving. So she was very much neglected. Remember, she's the one who wasn't found until the age of 12, locked alone in a room by herself with very, very little exposure to language. So no one really talked to Jeannie. So she is a kind of natural experiment, because obviously we would never be able to do a real experiment on a real child to see how language deprivation would affect your ability to speak. So for Jeannie, she received intensive intervention, right? So lots and lots and lots of help from psychologists. Intensive exposure to language after she was found, but she never developed that syntax. So remember, syntax, how we put words together to make sense. She never developed that syntax beyond the level of a 2-year-old child. So she never developed the ability to speak English the way that a native speaker would. So that gives us some indication that there's a fairly limited period. So remember, we talked about sensitive periods of development before. There's a fairly limited period in terms of the development of syntax. She was able, though, to continue learning new words, so new vocabulary words. And so we find that the learning of vocabulary words stays relatively plastic over the course of the lifespan, but there seems to be a pretty limited period to learn that syntax associated with the language. All right, and then we're going to look here at some additional influences on language development. So we've talked about language as being an inherently social process. So highlighting that, we have the research of Hart and Risley. So Hart and Risley, this was considered a landmark study at the time. The first part of their study came out in 1995, and they essentially found that infants who were of lower socioeconomic status, so typically infants who were living in poverty, in the home hear far less spoken language. So essentially adults are not talking to them as much as infants whose parents have more money. So part of that could be parents' overall level of education. Part of that could also be the level of stress potentially in the home. And so we find then that children who are exposed to more language through their parents talking to them early in life, that this is a good predictor of their vocabulary at age 3, and also their readiness for school later on down the line also. So I'll show you here. This is one of the major findings from their 1995 research study. So they had children who were living in what they at the time called welfare families. So this would be our low socioeconomic status children, children in working class families. So the parents have likely graduated from high school, but probably not from college. And then children in professional families, so professional, the parents likely have college degrees. And so as you can see, the level of language, the number of words that children are exposed to increases greatly as we move up in parents' education level. So that's probably not overly surprising, but was considered to be kind of a surprising, surprising finding at that particular point in research. All right, and then the last thing to note here also in chapter 5, things that you may have heard of before. So programs like Baby Einstein or Your Baby Can Read. So these kinds of programs that make the claim that they will be able to make your child smarter, right? Or teach your 12-month-old child how to read. So these programs are not overly successful. They seem to rely more on just kind of rote memorization as opposed to a child actually amassing language skills. And they don't typically work very well because they violate one of those fundamental principles of language development, which is language is a social process. So if you're plopping your kid down in front of a video and you're like, hey, you're going to learn how to speak a language just based on this very, very passive interaction, well, you're not going to learn it that way. You're going to learn a language through interaction with real people. And so that's part of the issue with these kinds of programs. So they're not seen as overly successful. So don't waste your money. All right, that is it for chapter 5.